Binotirai come kanje Shashino mongure tango taripiti Okuza kuziro Juka kuningi nino Kariza kumbugantu Juka kumbangarantu Mia se shokero Shaire shaya
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Africa for Dummies podcast, hosted as always by me, Nathan, and Zenge.
Hello, everybody.
Today, we're talking about the unfortunate genocide that occurred 100 years ago in Namibia by the hand of German colonialists. Since then, Germany and Namibia have had a long and bumpy road of reconciliation. To help us navigate this, we have Professor Henning Melber, who is a scholar of political science with a focus on Namibia. He has served in international institutes such as the Nordic-Africa Institute, the Institute for Commonwealth Studies, and was president of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institute. He is also a member of the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, which is the ruling party and was the liberating party of Namibia. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Henning Melber.
Thank you very much, Thenge and Nathan, for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure and privilege to interact with you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We're very happy to have you. I guess the first question that we have, not many people know Namibia. So just for starters, for those people that don't know Namibia, it's in Southwest Africa. It was a former colony of Germany, then became a UN trustship under the tutelage of South Africa. The first question is a basic one. What basically is the Namibian genocide? I think we all know it happened about 100 or so years ago. And why did it happen?
As you mentioned, Thenge, Namibia was first a German settler colony. It was dubbed as colonial property German Southwest Africa, and the German imperial empire occupied Namibia between 1884 and 1915 until World War I. Now, the settler colonial nature of parts of Namibia, mainly the central, eastern, and southern parts of Namibia, not the northern parts, which makes a distinction in the forms of colonial rule, they were basically directly affected by settler colonial encroachment.
Okay.
Meaning that infrastructure was imposed against the will of the local communities, also resulting in land grabs, in intimidation, and in a very unjust system against the local communities. Raping of women, humiliating of men, all the kind of undignified forms of foreign settler colonial rule.
Yeah.
That culminated in some resistance already starting in the 1890s. But ultimately leading in 1904 to military resistance led at that time by the Herero. And that triggered...
So there was resistance also from the people, the local Herero people themselves?
Yes, not only the Herero, but also the Nama communities and also other local communities. And it's very important to highlight that because very often the genocide narrative unintentionally but implicitly carries the message, oh, the poor Africans were only victims. No, they were also agents of history.
Yeah.
And basically, from a Namibian perspective, what happened then is called the Namibian-German War, which is a different label than the one of German genocide to Namibians.
Yeah.
So it's very important that there was primary resistance by local communities against the encroaching German settler colonial rule.
Yeah, so it's almost framed differently depending on the perspectives. From the Namibian side, it would be seen more as a war in which, they're all belligerents, whereas from the German side, it's seen as a genocide, no matter how, your understanding of the incidences in that time happened. So I guess the second question is one that Nathan was very interested in.
So with my interactions with German people and having visited Germany, I've realized that the German state has really done a good job of trying to ensure that people remember the atrocities of the past. for example, the Holocaust. They've made sure that their people know that this is something that shouldn't happen again. But I haven't seen any teaching or some sort of remembrance for this particular atrocity. Like, why do you think that some parts of German colonial history, as well as other colonial histories, have largely been forgotten or ignored?
Your observations of German daily life today are very correct, Nathan. There is this tendency that Germany is internationally recognized, duly recognized, as being a kind of world champion in commemoration of past atrocities, but focused mainly on the way Germany has dealt, not entirely voluntarily, I should add, with the Holocaust. And even the Holocaust remembrance is actually, until the very day, a contested one because it has remained to a large extent selective. The Holocaust included also mass extinction of gypsies, the Roma people, of queers, of the few Afro-Germans, which did exist then. It also culminated in warfare and extermination strategies in mainly Eastern Europe. And it's a still ongoing battle of other descendants of victim groups that they get the due recognition as the Shoah gets, where the extermination against the Jews is commemorated. But that in itself actually limits also German commemoration. It's almost like a mental block that you don't go further back because those were supposed to be the good old days.
So it's almost like Germany has too much stuff to commemorate that they want to like sort of rationalize and streamline which part of history they want to commemorate.
Absolutely, you're correct here, because it's almost like colonial amnesia, where people today say, oh, please, come on, stop. How much further you want us to go back? Isn't it enough?
Yeah.
And it shows a certain asymmetry because, of course, today in Germany, because of that colonial amnesia also in the public discourse for very long, it changes gradually in the last few years, but for very long, it means that those living in Germany today, unless they are engaged in post-colonial initiatives or have an Afro-German background or other related motives, they are unaware because it doesn't feature prominently in most of the German textbooks. And they will say, but what do you want us to do with that history, which is a footnote of German history? Well, it never has been a footnote in Namibian history or in East African history or in West African history. And what is considered a long bypassed past in Germany is present in Namibia, where the majority of commercial farmland is still in white possession.
Yeah, and that's becoming a very big issue with the incidences in Zimbabwe in the earlier part of the century, and then now recently the discussion of land reform in South Africa as well.
Yeah, Zimbabwe is a parallel process. South Africa is a parallel process. These were the former settler colonial territories, and settler colonialism did not come to an end with sovereignty because property relations continued. And while the so-called fast-track land reform in Zimbabwe addressed that in a rather unfortunate way and for the wrong reasons, it has been agreed in Namibia and in South Africa that this is not the right way to correct the past. You need to find different ways. But in the public perception of a Herero and the Nama, the Banderu, the Damara, and also the San communities, colonialism is alive. Because they are even denied to visit some of the graves of their ancestors if they happen to be situated on commercial farmland where the farmer says, this is my private property and you're not allowed to enter.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I think recently there was, and it's actually interesting that you mentioned the graves and being denied the right to pay your respects to your former ancestors and your loved ones. It's a good segue into, I think, the piece of news I heard, and you wrote it down in your article, I believe, about some remains of of bones of people that had died in the genocide in the early 20th century, being brought back to Namibia. And then also in the recent years, the last 10 years or so, there have been different pronouncements that have sort of indicated that Germany is acknowledging that it was a genocide. And
Exactly.
yeah, I think recently I think it's called the Joint Declaration. Basically, they both acknowledged that there was, mass atrocities, and Germany was going to pay 1.1 around that figure, 1.1 billion euros for development aid. So basically, the question is, I mean, Germany sounds like it's making the right noises, it's making the right pronouncements, coming to terms with its history. But at the same time, I understand the Herero, the senior chief among the Herero, refuted it and said, no, this is insult to injury. Why can't this be a done deal? Why aren't people happy, basically?
It's a very complex issue. We would actually need 4 hours to break it down. Let me start by saying the step Germany made by giving recognition that what happened then was tantamount to genocide in today's understanding is actually a step in the right direction. And it's actually a very new step which sets an example. It's due partly to the pressure by the stronger post-colonial initiatives since the turn of the century, which also raised their voices in the UK and in other countries, and add to the pressure on governments to face the atrocities of their colonial histories and trying to come to terms. But indeed, Germany, as a world champion when it comes to the Holocaust, is the first country which in public acknowledges this in such a format. But while this is a step in the right direction, it also entered on a slippery road the way it was translated.
Okay.
And that has several reasons. One is maybe an international dimension. They are afraid to create a precedent for themselves, but also for other countries. And while I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, I'm totally convinced that behind closed doors, the moment Germany announced that they are willing to admit that that was a genocide, which happened in 2015, and as a result, they initiated bilateral negotiations with the Namibian government, that from that moment on, it was not only carefully followed by other former colonial powers, but I'm absolutely sure it was a matter which was discussed behind closed doors in Brussels on the level of foreign European ministers. Because just imagine, Germany would give an unconditional recognition of the colonial atrocities. What that would imply for the colonial atrocities committed by the UK, by Belgium, by
That would be a ripple effect on everyone else. Yeah.
Absolutely, it would create a precedent and the pressure would totally increase. In the past, the Dutch and the British governments, each on one occasion, the British, in a court case, they lost with the of the Mau Mau, yes. They dished out some piecemeal compensation, but only to those who were still alive. Yeah. And the Dutch rendered an apology to the descendants of a village which was looted and extinguished in, I think it was the Philippines. Oh. But they were both very limited cases and both very carefully crafted to avoid a precedent. And that was exactly the context in which the German admission was then negotiated with the Namibian government. And part of these negotiations also entered some pitfalls by not really including in the sufficiently meaningful way the agencies of the descendants of those communities who were most affected, meaning the Herero, the Nama, the Banderu, but also the Damara and the San. These are the 5 communities in Namibia, which even in their totality are not a majority of the Namibian population, which were not really invited to the negotiation table, which means from the beginning they felt marginalized, sidelined, not adequately heard. And their slogan they promoted in campaigns very early on during the negotiations was, if not with us, then it's against us.
So basically, it was a state-to-state type of relationship. And basically, the state, obviously, the government of Namibia had different interests than the actual descendants and the ethnic groups affected by them. And the ethnic groups are actually a minority when it comes to the demographic makeup of Namibia. And it's actually quite interesting that you mentioned that they're very careful with how they deal with it, because genocide, I understand, is a legal term in international law. And even the word apartheid is also a legal term. You look at the relationship with Israel and Palestine, the whole reluctance to have people call it apartheid is because of the legal implications also involved, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think there was also an issue with calling it reparations, I think. Nobody wanted to call it reparations,
The term reparations is deliberately excluded from the draft agreement, which was initialed between the two special envoys of Germany and Namibia in mid-May of 2021. There is no reference to reparations. There is reference to a gesture of recognition.
A gesture.
Justice committed. Yes, a gesture of recognition. And they offer an apology, but the draft agreement already, just keep in mind the audacity that means. The draft agreement states this apology is accepted by the government and the Namibian people. So they initial a draft agreement where they decide that the descendants of the genocide accept the apology offered. I think this is just the arrogance of power, but not only from the German government. If I would be an over Herero or Nama, I would be totally insulted, because they were not the ones who agreed to that draft. And now they are told, once that is put by ratification into a legally valid document, they are basically having declared that they accept the apology.
And sorry, I think you may have mentioned this before, but was there any consultation with ethnic groups of Herero people between the German government and?
The Namibian government is eager to make reference that they had involved certain representatives of those groups in consultations and even had them invited to the table during the rounds of bilateral negotiations. But these were groups not representing the majority of those communities, but they were selected because of their closeness to SWAPO as the party which represents the government of Namibia. But that's not a fair and adequate representation of those communities. It's a political decision, and it shows the limitations of those bilateral negotiations. Now, having said that, of course, in the current system of international relations, these negotiations have to be initiated on a state-to-state level. But it does not prescribe to the government of a state who they are including or not. And it would have been entirely the free choice of the Namibian government to give the descendants of the local communities a meaningful representation and voice in these negotiations.
And it also moves to our next point, which is, I think, for about half a millennia, Africa has dealt with a lot of atrocious events and political establishments, from slavery to colonialism, from colonialism to genocides. What would you suggest is a comprehensive and sufficient way for former colonies and independent states to deal with their past atrocities?
Well, first of all, the tragedy is that since the times of the slave trade, the expansion of Europe, and also through settler colonial dominance in North America, in Australia and elsewhere, there were created structures economically, but to some extent even mentally, which cannot be reversed. So we only have to face the challenge, unfortunately so, how can we best cope with it and emancipate from slavery, as Bob Marley was singing in one of his songs. In the Babylon system. It is a Babylon system. So the challenge is, what can we do to deconstruct the asymmetric power relations, reduce them, and find ways to transform the asymmetric power relations into something which gives a fairer participation and treatment of the majority of the people in this world who have been subject to colonialism and imperialism. The part of that challenge is that there is a global pact among elites. I mean, as you know from other African countries, you have a local elite which is part of that universal system of dominance. They are parasites. They benefit from these unequal structures at the expense of the majority of the population. While on the other hand, of course, also in those industrialized countries of the West or the global North, while citizens benefit from these exploitation systems, which are still functional, they are at the same time also divided into citizens and subjects. We also have people at the receiving end in these countries who actually should be mobilized to fight against those unjust systems.
So it's sort of like somewhat of an animal farm type of situation. The liberators have sort of become the cooperating elite, and then there'll be people that will still have to fight through not only the local elite, but also the international elite. And I guess the whole message, as you're saying, is correct in the sense that there needs to be fair participation. And with this case, I think is a perfect example of how, the stakeholders, the main victims of it are not really the main stakeholders of the dialogue on reconciliation. And I guess that's more or less a segue into today. The average age in Namibia, I understand, is around 21. And, you get similar ages across Southern Africa and the rest of Africa, the youngest population in the world. And, it's going to be one of the fastest growing, if not already the fastest growing continent because of its age. And this happened over 100 years ago. So, I mean, from our age, we, as you said, we're born free, right? First of all, independence, it's quite a distance. So what more the genocide after 100 years ago? Why should a young Namibian or a young African really care about these things, the genocide? Because it happened 100 years ago.
Senge, let me start with your reference to George Orwell, because it's not by coincidence that quote from Animal Farm, that all animals are equal, some animals are more equal than others, is one of the most often repeated quotes when I visit cyberspace and go on Twitter and follow the frustrations expressed, especially by the younger generation of Namibians. And Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth has a renaissance in Southern Africa. And that book dates 60 years back. But if you read his chapter 3 on the pitfalls of national consciousness, it's as if he wrote it yesterday. So coming back to your question, the younger generation has all reasons to measure governance and social realities against the delivery of those in power, or rather non-delivery by those in power, who have as their so-called national interests, their individual interests as a priority. And that, of course, leads back to the inequalities and structural asymmetries I referred to already in colonial times. They are no past.
Yeah.
Colonialism lives on. The Indian sociologist Ashish Nandy called it the intimate enemy, meaning the internalization of a colonial system by those who execute colonialism under the cosmetics of national sovereignty for their own interests. Nowadays, colonial systems in Southern Africa are dominated by blacks in political power. But the systems we have in Southern Africa, and most likely in other parts of the world, remain colonial systems.
Yeah.
And the younger generations, and I'm now talking on behalf of you, because you are the younger generation, not me. I'm the old white man who makes the point that not all white men are racist, whatever. But you have all reasons to say, what's true liberation? Because you reproduce a system which remains in its substance colonial.
Yeah.
And that's why also revisiting the history is a matter to know where one comes from, but also to position oneself with defining the goals. Where do we want to go to? You cannot abandon the history. You need to revisit history, to learn from history, and to use that knowledge accumulated and the insights to map an agenda for the future.
That was well said. That was
Yeah,
very
that was
good.
well-
Yeah, I can't even add to it, yeah.
So for our last question, Professor Melba would like to ask, what do you care most in relation to Namibia, given your long-standing relationship with the country?
And also as a member of the ruling party, the South
exactly,
African
yeah.
People's Organization.
That's actually a very personal question, and I have to answer it in a personal way. What I care most about Namibia is the biggest gift Namibia made me. That's my daughter, Tulinawa Salomea Leketo. She is the gift of Namibian independence. And my wish is that we all are able to create a future Namibia which provides human dignity for all people in the country.
Human
Meaning,
dignity.
of course, also my daughter.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to end, and on a much more positive note.
So hopefully that was very beneficial to our listeners. And I would just like to thank you so much, Professor Henning Melber, for joining us here. You know, the thing is, you've written so many great articles that it was a huge debate between me and Zengi. We were trying to figure out which one we should get you in for. Like, he talked about entrepreneurship, he talked about this, and we finally settled on this because, you know, even for me, Zambia and Namibia is a neighbor, basically. I never really knew about this
It's still a very silent part of history, even in Africa, in the neighborhood. Literally, it's a very silent part of history, and I think it's quite important to shed light on that and sort of relate it with, as you said, how youths can be able to grasp on that and work with that in the contemporary world, and the meaning of that, because often if it's in the past, it's, you know, people don't assume it to have any relevance.
So thank you on behalf of sorry, I was going to say on behalf of Zengi, but thank you on behalf of our fans, the Dummies. We call them the Dummies. Thank you on behalf of I think of the Southern African community for helping us understand this a little bit better. So
I would like to thank both of you, Nathan and Zengi, for providing me this opportunity for an exchange between me of a different generation and a different cultural background, and you representing the present and the future of the continent. I think those conversations are important, and they humble me because I feel very much recognized if your generation has an interest in engaging with me and my views. And I hope it contributes a bit to this better future we all deserve in the name of humanity and dignity.
I say, Johero shaire shaya. Humbata, no. Johero shaire shaya. You got to let it go. You got to let it flow. Let it go with the wind.